The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison slammed his gavel with the force of a man who believed his word was law. The sound echoed through the packed chamber like a gunshot, and every eye turned to the defendant sitting calmly in the front row. Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch. He didn't look down. He just sat there, his hands folded, his expression unreadable, like a man who had seen storms before and knew this was just another passing cloud. "Boy!" The judge's voice cut through the air like a whip. "You stand up when I'm talking to you." The word hung in the air like poison. Every black face in that courtroom felt the sting, but Bumpy Johnson just slowly, deliberately rose to his feet. His movements were controlled, measured, the kind of calm that comes from a man who knows exactly who he is and refuses to let anyone else define it. The year was 1952, and Harlem's most feared and respected figure was standing trial for charges that everyone knew were trumped up. Judge Harrison thought he was dealing with just another street criminal. He had no idea he was about to learn a lesson that would haunt him for the rest of his career. To understand what happened in that courtroom that day, you need to go back to who Bumpy Johnson really was. This wasn't just some gangster from the streets. This was a man who had built an empire on respect, intelligence, and an unwavering code of honor. While other men used violence as their first language, Bumpy spoke in strategy. When others saw problems, he saw opportunities. And when faced with injustice, he didn't get angry, he got even. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in Charleston, South Carolina, Bumpy had learned early that the world wasn't fair. But instead of letting that break him, he used it as fuel. By the time he reached Harlem, he had already decided that if society was going to treat him like an outsider, he'd build his own society, one where loyalty mattered more than the color of your skin, and respect was earned, not given. The charges against him were simple: running an illegal gambling operation. The truth was more complicated. Bumpy had been protecting his neighborhood from corrupt cops who were shaking down local businesses. He'd been feeding families when the government wouldn't. He'd been building something that the establishment couldn't control, and that scared them. Judge Harrison represented everything wrong with the system. A man who had inherited his position through family connections, who had never walked the streets of Harlem, who saw black men as problems to be solved rather than human beings deserving of justice. He looked at Bumpy and saw what he wanted to see: a criminal who needed to be put in his place. "You think you're untouchable, don't you, boy?" Harrison continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think because you've got your little gang of thugs you can do whatever you want in my city?" The prosecutor, a thin man named Whitmore, shuffled his papers nervously. Even he seemed uncomfortable with the judge's tone, but he wasn't about to cross Harrison. This was bigger than just one case. This was about sending a message to every black man in Harlem who dared to think he could build something of his own. Bumpy's lawyer, a sharp Jewish attorney named Samuel Goldman, started to object, but Bumpy held up his hand. Just a small gesture, but it was enough. Goldman sat back down. Bumpy wanted to handle this himself. "Your Honor," Bumpy said, his voice steady and respectful, "I'm not sure what you mean by untouchable. I'm standing right here, aren't I?" The simplicity of the response caught Harrison off guard. He had expected defiance, anger, something he could use to justify whatever he was planning to do. Instead, he got calm dignity, and it made him even angrier. "Don't you get smart with me," Harrison barked. "I've dealt with your kind before. You people think you can come up from the South and turn our neighborhoods into your own personal playgrounds. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not happening, not on my watch." The jury, all white, all carefully selected, watched this exchange with the kind of fascination usually reserved for a car accident. They had come expecting a simple case, but they were witnessing something else entirely. They were watching two different visions of America clash in real time. Bumpy looked directly at Harrison, and for just a moment something passed between them. Not anger, not hatred, recognition. Harrison was used to dealing with men who would either cower or explode when faced with his authority. But Bumpy was something different. He was a man who understood power, real power, and wasn't intimidated by the theater of it. "I understand, Your Honor," Bumpy said quietly. "You're just doing your job." The words were respectful, but there was something underneath them. Something that made Harrison pause, made him wonder if maybe this defendant knew something he didn't. Something that made the smart money in the gallery start to shift nervously in their seats. Because what Judge Harrison didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Bumpy Johnson hadn't come to court unprepared. He never did anything unprepared. And while they thought they were watching him get put in his place, he was actually 3 moves ahead in a game they didn't even know they were playing. The real question wasn't whether Bumpy would survive this trial. The question was whether Judge Harrison would survive what was about to happen next. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Judge Harrison was just getting started. He leaned forward in his chair, his face twisted with the kind of hatred that comes from years of unchecked power and deep-seated prejudice. "Let me tell you something, boy," Harrison said, his voice rising with each word. "I've been sitting on this bench for 23 years, and I've seen plenty of your kind come through here thinking they're hot stuff. You know what happens to every single one of them? They end up in Sing Sing, forgotten and broken." The gallery was dead silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. This wasn't justice. This was a public lynching in broad daylight, and everyone knew it. Prosecutor Whitmore cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor, perhaps we should proceed with the evidence presentation." "I'll decide how this court proceeds," Harrison snapped, not even looking at the prosecutor. His eyes were locked on Bumpy like a predator sizing up its prey. This defendant and his criminal organization have been a cancer on this city for too long. Running numbers, corrupting our youth, turning decent neighborhoods into war zones. What Harrison didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that every word he spoke was being absorbed and catalogued by one of the sharpest minds ever to walk the streets of Harlem. Bumpy wasn't just listening, he was learning. He was studying his enemy, understanding exactly who he was dealing with and calculating his next move with the precision of a chess grandmaster. The truth about the charges was simple. Bumpy had been protecting his community from the very corruption that Harrison represented. When dirty cops tried to shake down Mrs. Washington's grocery store, Bumpy stepped in. When city officials demanded kickbacks from local businesses, Bumpy made sure they got the message that Harlem wasn't for sale. When young men in his neighborhood needed work instead of turning to crime, Bumpy created opportunities. But Harrison saw none of that. All he saw was a black man who refused to bow his head, and that was unforgivable. "You think you're some kind of king up in Harlem, don't you?" Harrison continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Well, let me remind you where you really stand. You're in my courtroom now, and here I'm the only king that matters." Bumpy's lawyer, Samuel Goldman, was frantically scribbling notes for what he knew would be a strong appeal. This kind of judicial misconduct was so blatant that even the most conservative appeals court would have to overturn any conviction. But Goldman also knew that overturning the conviction wouldn't undo the humiliation Harrison was trying to inflict. That's when something remarkable happened. Bumpy Johnson smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth. But in that moment it was the most powerful thing in the room, because it wasn't the smile of a man who was beaten. It was the smile of a man who knew something everyone else didn't. "Your Honor," Bumpy said, his voice still calm and respectful, "I want you to know that I have nothing but respect for this court, and for the law." Harrison's face flushed red. He had expected anger, defiance, fear, anything he could use to justify the sentence he had already decided to hand down. But this calm dignity was infuriating him. "Don't you patronize me!" Harrison shouted, slamming his gavel so hard the handle cracked. "I know exactly what you are. You're a thug, a criminal, a menace to society. And before this day is over, I'm going to make sure you get exactly what you deserve." The jury shifted uncomfortably. Even they could see this had gone too far. Mrs. Henderson, a middle-aged schoolteacher who had been selected for the jury, looked genuinely disturbed. She hadn't signed up to witness a lynching masquerading as a trial, but Bumpy just nodded thoughtfully, as if he was genuinely considering Harrison's words. "I understand your position, Your Honor. A man in your situation has to make difficult decisions." There was something in the way he said "your situation" that made Harrison pause. something that suggested maybe Bumpy knew more about Harrison's situation than Harrison was comfortable with. Because the truth was, Judge Harrison had his own secrets. Secrets that he thought were buried deep enough that no one would ever find them. Secrets about where his money really came from. About the deals he had made with certain Italian families who controlled the docks. About the verdicts he had bought and sold over the years. What Harrison didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson made it his business to know everything about everyone who had power in the city. Information was currency in Harlem, and Bumpy was the richest man in town when it came to what people didn't want others to know. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," Harrison said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied look of a man who thought he held all the cards. "This jury is going to find you guilty, because that's what juries do when the evidence is clear. Then I'm going to sentence you to the maximum penalty allowed by law, and then you're going to disappear into the system for a very long time." Bumpy nodded again as if this was exactly what he had expected. "That's certainly your prerogative, Your Honor." The calm acceptance in Bumpy's voice was starting to unnerve even the court officers. They had seen defendants break down, seen them rage, seen them beg. They had never seen someone face 20 years in prison with this kind of serene confidence. Samuel Goldman was about to object to the entire proceeding when Bumpy caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Goldman had represented enough wise guys to recognize the look. His client wasn't worried about this trial. His client was playing a completely different game. "In fact," Harrison continued, now fully convinced he had the upper hand, "I think we should expedite this process. I'm going to recommend to the prosecutor that he seek the maximum charges available. Let's make an example out of you that every other would-be gangster in this city won't forget." That's when Bumpy Johnson did something that no one expected. He turned around and looked directly at the gallery. His eyes moved slowly across the faces of the people who had come to watch. Reporters, community leaders, curious onlookers. But he wasn't looking at them randomly. He was looking at specific people, people whose presence Harrison hadn't even noticed. There was Detective Murphy from Internal Affairs sitting quietly in the back row. There was Mrs. Colombo, wife of Vincent Colombo, who controlled most of the dock operations. There was even City Councilman Bradley, who had been notably absent from public events lately. They were all there, all watching, all waiting. Bumpy turned back to face the judge, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire courtroom with perfect clarity. "Your Honor, before you make your final decision, there's something I think you should know." Harrison frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, carefully, making sure everyone could see what he was doing. He pulled out a simple manila envelope and placed it on the defendant's table. "I think we should discuss this in private first." The envelope sat there like a bomb waiting to explode. Harrison stared at it, and for the first time all day uncertainty flickered across his face, because Judge Harrison was finally starting to understand that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the one in control of this courtroom after all. They thought they had broken him. They were wrong. Judge Harrison stared at that manila envelope like it was a coiled snake ready to strike. The confidence that had carried him through 23 years on the bench was starting to crack, and everyone in that courtroom could see it. "What's in that envelope?" Harrison demanded, but his voice had lost its thunderous authority. Now it sounded more like a man who was starting to realize he might have walked into a trap. Bumpy Johnson stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your Honor, I think that's a conversation we should have in your chambers, away from the jury." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. You could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the shuffling of papers, the nervous breathing of 12 jurors who were starting to understand they weren't watching a simple trial anymore. They were watching a chess match between two masters, and one of them was about to be checkmated. Samuel Goldman, Bumpy's lawyer, was frantically trying to figure out what his client was doing. In all his years of practice, he had never seen a defendant take control of a courtroom like this. But Goldman was smart enough to recognize genius when he saw it, even if he couldn't understand the strategy yet. "I'll decide what conversations we have and where we have them," Harrison snapped, but the conviction was gone from his voice. He was a man grasping for control that was slipping away like water through his fingers. That's when Detective Murphy from Internal Affairs stood up in the back of the courtroom. Your Honor, if I may, I think the defendant's request might be advisable. Every head in the room turned. Internal Affairs didn't speak up in court cases unless something big was happening. Murphy was known as a straight shooter, one of the few honest cops left in a department that was riddled with corruption. If he was backing Bumpy Johnson's play, there was more going on here than anyone realized. Harrison's face went pale. Detective Murphy, this is highly irregular. So is conducting a trial where the judge has already decided the verdict, Murphy said quietly. His words cut through the air like a blade. Your Honor, the prosecutor Whitmore was now sweating visibly. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in the middle of a minefield. Your Honor, perhaps we should take a brief recess. No! Harrison's voice cracked like a whip, but it was the sound of desperation, not authority. This trial will proceed as scheduled. The defendant will sit down and we will continue with the presentation of evidence. But Bumpy Johnson didn't sit down. Instead, he did something that sent shockwaves through the entire room. He smiled. Not the small, knowing smile from before. This was different. This was the smile of a man who had been playing a game that everyone else was just now beginning to understand. Your Honor, Bumpy said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I need you to understand something. I didn't come to this courtroom to be judged by you. I came here to judge you. The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Judge Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. In 23 years on the bench, no defendant had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever dared. How dare you? Harrison began, but Bumpy held up his hand. Let me tell you what's in that envelope, Your Honor. It's photographs. Photographs of you leaving the Palermo Social Club last Tuesday night. Photographs of you shaking hands with Vincent Colombo. Photographs of you accepting an envelope that contained $20,000 in cash. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were scribbling furiously, spectators were gasping, and the jury was staring in shock. But Harrison just sat there, frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. That's impossible, Harrison whispered, but his voice was barely audible. The Palermo Social Club, Bumpy continued, his voice steady and methodical, where you've been meeting with organized crime figures for the past 18 months, where you've been selling verdicts, dismissing charges, and making sure certain cases never see the inside of a courtroom. Samuel Goldman was now understanding exactly what his client had been planning. This wasn't just about beating the charges. This was about exposing the entire corrupt system that had allowed men like Harrison to destroy lives while hiding behind the law. Detective Murphy stepped forward. Your Honor, I have a warrant here for your arrest on charges of bribery, corruption, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The envelope on the defendant's table wasn't just evidence against Harrison. It was the culmination of months of careful investigation, surveillance, and strategic planning. While Harrison thought he was dealing with just another street criminal, Bumpy Johnson had been building a case that would bring down not just one corrupt judge, but an entire network of officials who had been feeding off the suffering of Harlem. You see, Your Honor, Bumpy said, stepping closer to the bench, the difference between you and me is simple. You thought power came from the robe you wear and the gavel you hold. But real power comes from knowing the truth. And the truth is that you're not a judge. You're a criminal who's been hiding behind justice for too long. Harrison's hands were shaking now. This is entrapment. This is illegal. What's illegal, Bumpy interrupted, is selling justice to the highest bidder while innocent people rot in jail. What's illegal is taking money from the mob while lecturing others about the law. What's illegal is exactly what you've been doing for years. The courtroom was in complete chaos now. Reporters were rushing to phones, court officers were moving into position, and the jury was watching history unfold before their eyes. But in the center of it all, Bumpy Johnson stood calm and composed, like the eye of a hurricane. Mrs. Colombo, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, was now heading for the exit. City Councilman Bradley was nowhere to be seen. He had slipped out the moment Murphy stood up. The rats were abandoning the ship and everyone could see it. The investigation into your activities began 6 months ago, Detective Murphy announced. now standing beside the defendant's table. Mr. Johnson has been working with Internal Affairs and the FBI to expose corruption at every level of the city government. Harrison's world was crumbling around him, but he made one last desperate attempt to salvage his authority. Even if that's true, this defendant is still guilty of the charges against him. That's when Bumpy Johnson delivered the final blow. Actually, Your Honor, the charges against me were filed by Detective Reynolds, who, according to the FBI investigation, has been on Vincent Colombo's payroll for the past 2 years. The evidence against me was collected during illegal searches that Reynolds conducted without proper warrants. And the witnesses against me have all been coached by prosecutors who were taking money from the same crime families you've been working with. The silence that followed was absolute. Judge Harrison looked around the courtroom like a man searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. His corrupt empire was collapsing and there was nowhere left to run. In other words, Bumpy continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of vindication, every single aspect of this case is tainted by the same corruption that's been poisoning this city's justice system for years. Harrison slumped in his chair, a broken man who had finally met someone smarter, more patient and more determined than himself. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't finished yet. The judge's fall was just the beginning. What came next would ensure that this moment became legend, and that no one would ever again mistake Harlem's protector for just another street criminal. The real reckoning was just about to begin. Judge Harrison sat in his chair like a king watching his kingdom burn around him. The courtroom that had been his domain for over 2 decades was now his execution chamber, and Bumpy Johnson was the executioner. But Harrison wasn't going down without a fight. "This is all circumstantial," Harrison shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Photographs can be doctored. This is nothing but a conspiracy to discredit this court." Detective Murphy stepped forward with another envelope, this one thicker than the first. "Your Honor, we also have recordings." The word recordings hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Every person in that room understood what that meant. In 1952, recordings were rare, expensive, and absolutely devastating when they existed. If they had Harrison's voice on tape, his career wasn't just over, his life as he knew it was finished. "Recordings of what?" Harrison demanded, but his voice was barely a whisper now. Bumpy Johnson walked slowly to the evidence table and picked up a small recording device that nobody had noticed before. It had been sitting there the entire trial, hidden in plain sight among the legal documents. He held it up for everyone to see. "Recordings of every conversation you've had in this courtroom today, Your Honor, including the part where you called me boy 17 times, where you admitted you'd already decided my verdict before hearing any evidence, and where you threatened to make sure I got the maximum sentence regardless of what the law required." The jury was staring in complete shock. They had witnessed judicial misconduct in real time, but now they realized it had all been documented. Every racist comment, every abuse of power, every violation of due process, it was all on tape. Harrison's face went from pale to gray. That's illegal recording without consent." Samuel Goldman stood up with a smile that could have lit up Broadway. "Actually, Your Honor, under New York state law, recording court proceedings is completely legal as long as they don't disrupt the trial. And since this device was completely silent, there was no disruption." But Bumpy wasn't finished, not even close. "Detective Murphy," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "would you please play the recording from last Thursday night?" Murphy nodded and produced a larger recording device. The courtroom fell silent as he set it up on the prosecutor's table. Even the reporters had stopped writing, understanding that they were about to witness something historic. The recording crackled to life, and suddenly Judge Harrison's voice filled the courtroom. But this wasn't the voice of a dignified jurist. This was the voice of a corrupt criminal making deals in the shadows. "Vincent, I need that Johnson case to go away. I don't care what it costs or who you have to pay off. If he starts talking about what he knows, we're all going down." The voice on the recording was unmistakably Harrison's, but the response that followed made the blood drain from his face entirely. "Don't worry, Your Honor. We'll make sure he never makes it to trial. These accidents happen all the time in Harlem." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters were shouting questions. Spectators were gasping in horror, and the jury was staring at Harrison like they were looking at the devil himself. But through it all, Bumpy Johnson stood perfectly calm, watching his enemy's world collapse with the satisfaction of a man who had planned every move. "That recording," Bumpy said, his voice cutting through the noise like a sword, "was made in Vincent Colombo's office last Thursday. The same office where you've been meeting every week for the past 18 months. The same office where you've been selling verdicts to the highest bidder." Harrison was shaking now, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. "This is entrapment, this is a setup. You can't use illegally obtained evidence." That's when Detective Murphy delivered the killing blow. "Actually, Your Honor, that recording was obtained with a federal warrant as part of a RICO investigation into organized crime activities. The FBI has been investigating corruption in the New York court system for over a year, and you've been the primary target." The word RICO sent shockwaves through the gallery. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was new, but everyone understood what it meant. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. This was about an entire criminal enterprise that had been operating under the cover of law. Bumpy Johnson walked slowly toward the bench, and for the first time all day, Judge Harrison actually looked afraid. "You see, Your Honor," Bumpy said, his voice now carrying the full weight of vindication, "while you were busy calling me boy and thinking I was just another street thug, I was doing what you should have been doing all along. I was serving justice." The recording continued to play in the background, and with each word Harrison's corruption became more apparent. Discussions about fixing cases, splitting money with organized crime figures, and even planning the elimination of witnesses who might testify against them. "Every family you destroyed with your corrupt verdicts," Bumpy continued, stepping closer to the bench. "Every innocent man you sent to prison because someone paid you to do it. Every time you perverted justice for money. It's all documented, it's all recorded, and it's all going to come out." Harrison made one last desperate attempt to maintain his authority. He grabbed his gavel and raised it high above his head. "I am still the judge in this courtroom. I still have the power to—" "No," Bumpy said quietly, but his voice carried more authority than Harrison's gavel ever could. "You don't." That's when FBI agent Martinez stepped through the courtroom doors, flanked by federal marshals. The cavalry had arrived, and Harrison's fate was sealed. "Judge Harrison," Agent Martinez announced, his voice formal and final, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice, and racketeering under the federal RICO statute." The gavel fell from Harrison's hand and clattered to the floor. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a death knell, the final note in the symphony of his downfall. As the federal marshals moved to arrest him, Harrison looked at Bumpy Johnson one last time. His eyes were filled with a mixture of hatred, fear, and something else, respect, because in that moment he finally understood who he had been dealing with. "How?" Harrison whispered. "How did you know?" Bumpy Johnson smiled, but it wasn't cruel or vindictive. It was the smile of a man who had just reminded the world that justice, real justice, doesn't come from a robe or a gavel. It comes from truth, courage, and the willingness to fight for what's right. "Your Honor," Bumpy said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "In my neighborhood, we have a saying, the streets have eyes, and the walls have ears. You forgot that justice doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the people." The federal marshals placed handcuffs on Judge Harrison's wrists, and as they led him away, the man who had thought he was untouchable realized that he had just been brought down by someone he had dismissed as nothing more than a common criminal. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Harrison was escorted out, but before he reached the door he turned back one more time. "This isn't over, Johnson," he shouted, his voice breaking with rage and desperation. Bumpy Johnson looked him straight in the eye and delivered the final words that would haunt Harrison for the rest of his life. "Yes, it is." But what happened next would cement this moment in Harlem legend forever. The federal marshal's footsteps echoed down the marble corridor as they led Judge Harrison away in handcuffs, but the real story was just beginning. What happened in that courtroom on that day in 1952 would ripple through the halls of power for decades to come, reshaping not just Harlem, but the entire landscape of American justice. Within 24 hours, Harrison's arrest had made front-page news in every major newspaper from New York to Los Angeles. "Corrupt judge exposed by Harlem kingpin" read the headline in the New York Times, but the reporters had no idea they were covering more than just one man's downfall. They were witnessing the birth of a legend. Judge Harrison's trial became a media sensation. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that his own lawyers advised him to plead guilty. The recordings, the photographs, the financial records, everything Bumpy Johnson had methodically collected over 18 months painted a picture of corruption so deep that it shocked even seasoned prosecutors. During Harrison's sentencing hearing, the federal judge who replaced him said something that would be quoted for generations. The defendant used the sacred trust of judicial office to line his own pockets while denying justice to those who needed it most. But perhaps the most damning evidence against him is that it took a man he called a criminal to expose his crimes. Harrison received 25 years in federal prison. He died behind bars in 1967, a broken man who had lost everything: his position, his wealth, his family, and his legacy. The judge who had thought he was untouchable learned too late that true power doesn't come from a robe or a title. It comes from respect, and respect must be earned. But the real transformation happened in the weeks and months that followed. The FBI investigation that Bumpy had helped orchestrate led to the arrest of 17 other officials, including 3 more judges, 6 prosecutors, and 8 police commanders. The entire corrupt network that had been feeding off Harlem's suffering was dismantled piece by piece. Detective Murphy was promoted to deputy commissioner and led the effort to clean up the police department. Samuel Goldman was appointed to a federal judgeship, becoming one of the first Jewish judges in New York. And Vincent Colombo? He disappeared one night and was never seen again. The streets of Harlem had their own way of dealing with those who threatened the community. As for the charges against Bumpy Johnson, they were dropped entirely, not just dismissed, completely expunged from the record. The new judge ruled that every piece of evidence had been tainted by corruption, making the case legally impossible to prosecute. But more than that, the federal government quietly let it be known that Bumpy had been working as an unofficial consultant in their investigation of organized crime. The truth was more complex than anyone realized. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just been protecting Harlem from corrupt officials. He had been gathering intelligence that would help the federal government crack down on organized crime throughout the Northeast. While everyone saw him as a gangster, he was actually helping to clean up the very system that had oppressed his community for decades. The transformation of Harlem was immediate and dramatic. With the corrupt cops gone, local businesses flourished. With the dirty judges removed, fair trials became possible. With the crooked prosecutors replaced, justice finally had a chance to work the way it was supposed to. Washington's grocery store, which had been struggling under police shakedowns, became one of the most successful businesses in the neighborhood. The young men who had been arrested on trumped-up charges were released and given opportunities to build legitimate careers. Children who had grown up afraid of the police began to see them as protectors rather than predators. But perhaps the most important change was in how people thought about power and justice. Before that day in court, many people believed that the system was rigged against them and that there was nothing they could do about it. Bumpy Johnson proved that even the most powerful people in society were not above the law, as long as someone was brave enough and smart enough to hold them accountable. The story spread throughout Harlem like wildfire, growing with each telling. Soon everyone had heard about the day when Bumpy Johnson walked into a racist judge's courtroom and walked out a free man while the judge was led away in handcuffs. Children would act out the scene in playgrounds. Parents would tell it as a bedtime story about standing up to bullies. Community leaders would reference it in speeches about the power of truth over corruption. Years later, when civil rights leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. came to Harlem, they would hear this story and understand something fundamental about the community they were trying to reach. These weren't people who needed to be taught to fight injustice. They were people who had already seen it done, and done brilliantly. The recording of Harrison calling Bumpy boy 17 times became legendary. It was played at community meetings, referenced in sermons, and quoted in speeches about dignity and respect. But what people remembered most wasn't the judge's racism. It was Bumpy's response. His calm dignity in the face of hatred. his strategic brilliance in turning the enemy's arrogance against him, his unwavering commitment to justice over revenge. Malcolm X himself once said, "Bumpy Johnson showed us that the master's tools could indeed dismantle the master's house, if you were smart enough to know how to use them." The lesson wasn't lost on future generations. When young civil rights activists planned sit-ins and freedom rides, they studied Bumpy's strategy. When community organizers faced corrupt politicians, they remembered his patience and preparation. When people felt powerless against institutional racism, they thought about that day when one man's courage changed everything. Today, nearly 70 years later, that courtroom confrontation is still talked about in law schools as an example of how the justice system can be corrupted and how it can be redeemed. The case is studied by FBI agents learning about organized crime. It's referenced by scholars writing about the civil rights movement. It's taught to young lawyers as a lesson in how preparation and truth can overcome power and privilege. But in Harlem, the story means something different. It's not just a case study or a historical footnote. It's a reminder that no one is untouchable, that justice belongs to everyone, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remain calm and let your enemies destroy themselves. The judge's chair, where Harrison sat in arrogance, is now in a museum. The gavel he used to terrorize defendants is displayed next to a plaque that reads, "Power without justice is tyranny. Justice without power is meaningless. But when truth and courage come together, they can move mountains." And in the neighborhood where Bumpy Johnson lived and died, where he protected and served, where he loved and was loved in return, children still grow up hearing about the day when their community's protector walked into a courtroom and reminded the world that respect isn't given, it's earned. The game had rules. Bumpy Johnson knew them better than anyone else. He didn't just win that day. He changed the game forever. Some victories echo through eternity. This was one of them.